Glad to see you tonight. Some of our folks are at West End at the area-wide youth devotional, and they'll be having a good time. And I think it's marvelous that our young people in the area get together each month, and it gives them a chance to get to know one another. And who knows but what they may find that special one. And I would rather have them look among other Christians than among a lot of other people in the world. So I'm glad that they are here. And it must be catchy. Chris, you did a good job. Appreciate it. Sang out, and the congregation sang with him, and that's just a marvelous thing. I want you to know it's about 18 minutes till kickoff. Not to worry. Rusty will be checking it periodically, and we will have incoming scores if there are scores early in the game. Just kidding, of course, lest somebody think that I mean that. Philippians chapter 1. This is lesson number 3 in our series on Philippians. And I want to read verses 12 through 18 with you. So you have your Bible, or you use an electronic device to look up scriptures, that's just fine. Just make sure it's not email you're looking up. Philippians chapter 1, beginning at verse 12. But I want you to know, brethren, that the things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel, so that it has become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ. And most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ even from envy and strife, and some also from goodwill. The former preach Christ from selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my chains. But the latter out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached. And in this I rejoice, yea, and will rejoice. Have you heard the saying that starts out this way, and you can finish it? If the world gives you lemonade, if it gives you lemons, make lemonade. Paul never heard that, I'm sure. That was not a saying that he went around and said, oh, by the way, if the world gives you lemons, make lemonade. But I believe he believed that. Here's how he said it. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love the Lord. Not to them only, but also to all who love his appearing. Paul believed that good can come from bad. I want to know if you believe that. Really in your soul believe that when bad things happen, God, who is always in control, can make good things come out of that. Paul had always wanted to go to Rome. He wanted to go as a preacher. Well, he went, but he went as a prisoner. Acts 28 records it. I'm not going to read that chapter in Acts to you. But if you read it, it will tell you about the things that happened to Paul, his trip to Rome, and his arrival there. Paul was actually in Roman prison twice. He was there roughly between AD 60 to 62 under what we often call house arrest, which means that he had a lot of liberty. He could have people in. He could talk to them, preach to them. He was able to write extensively. Later, he was arrested the second time after being released from that house arrest. And this time, he would not be released. Nero put Paul to death, had him beheaded. There's a lot of discussion, debate, as to which trip to Rome it was that caused him to write Philippians. Was it the first trip, the house arrest? Was it the second trip when he was staring death in the face and he knew it? You can find ink spilled on both sides of that. I read so much about that I begin to go cross-eyed and think, oh my. And I realized that most people didn't know a whole lot more about it than I did. My judgment probably is that it was his second trip. I'll give you a little bit of why I believe that in a minute. But whether it was his first trip or his second trip takes nothing away from the power of this epistle. He is there in chains. In Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 20, which is just across the page in my New Testament, he says, "For which I am an ambassador in chains." That is, that I may speak boldly as I ought to speak. An ambassador in chains. The word chains there is very interesting. We think of chains as maybe you have a chain, a prisoner has chains around his ankle and there's some length to it and it is attached to something in the wall. The word that's used there actually means a very short length of chain. One where one section of it would be attached to the prisoner's wrist and the other part would be attached to the jailer's wrist. You would have very little movement, very little freedom. If it is the second time that Paul went to Rome, can you imagine him sitting there, chained to a Roman soldier with a short length of chain, and he's trying to write? Some have suggested that he may have dictated this letter, and somebody else might actually have been, here's one of my favorite words, the amanuensis. That simply means the person who wrote it down. It's easier to say that way than to say amanuensis, isn't it? I don't know whether it was his first imprisonment or his second imprisonment. But I know he's in prison. He's a prisoner in chains. And I know that he writes this letter to people that he loves dearly, who have stood by him through what we might say thick and thin. How would the Philippians respond to this? They know Paul's there. There's a go-between, Epaphroditus, who goes between Paul and the Philippians. Might they feel anger? There doesn't sound like there's any anger with Paul when he writes this letter? Could they have had sympathy? Poor Paul, bless his heart. Doesn't sound like there's any feelings like that on the part of Paul. Could they have been unconcerned, like his problem, not mine? I don't think so. Because they loved him dearly and he loved them, and we read that and studied that in the first part of chapter 1. Paul wanted them to see the good that could come out of that. I've never heard an inmate, a prisoner, say, this was really great. This was good. I'm glad that I was locked up because good things came out of it. I've heard them complain, find fault with everything and everybody, profess their innocence. But Paul, on the other hand, said, brethren, I want you to think about this in a different way. I want you to realize that God's in control and that good has actually come out of this. He said, first of all, it gave me the opportunity to preach the gospel to people I never would have had the opportunity to meet and preach to otherwise. He said, all of this has fallen out for the furtherance of the gospel. Do you suppose that if Paul had not been in prison, he would have had the opportunity to preach to the guards? When Paul was chained to that guard, or even if it was a paid guard that was just there to make sure that things ran smoothly, what do you think Paul did every chance he got? I'm sure he said, let me tell you about Jesus. I want to tell you what he's done for me, how he changed my life. And he can do the same for you, no matter who you are or what you've done. There's a word that's interesting here in verse 13. It's called the palace guard. In your margin, you may find the word praetorium. Who were these guards? They were the guards that were assigned to the emperor. They weren't your average run-of-the-mill guards. These were the elite. These were the Green Berets. These were the guys who were charged to protect Nero at the cost of their own life if necessary. And he preached to them. He preached to people in the emperor's palace. Can you imagine that? Hey, you, come here. You're one of the Praetorian guards. You guard the emperor. I want to tell you about Jesus. And it seems that there were opportunities that he would never have had any other way. In chapter 4 and verse 22, he says, all the saints greet you, but especially those who are of Caesar's household. Isn't that marvelous? That he didn't just preach to these people in Caesar's household. He actually converted some of them. That'd be a hard nut to crack, wouldn't it? Here are people who serve the Caesar, who are in his household. And yet Paul said, these people greet you. They're your brothers and sisters. I really doubt if the people who received this letter expected to learn that they had brothers and sisters in Caesar's household. But they did, because of Paul. And he only had the opportunity to accomplish that because he was in prison. And he looked at that in a whole different way and said, this is actually a good thing. He said, secondly, it has emboldened others. There are other people who have heard what I've gone through, and they've taken courage from that. There are people who just encourage me without ever knowing they do. May I mention Lisa Lee tonight? I complain about how hard it is for me to get ready and come to church. There are things I have to have done for me that I can't do for myself. And women who love me, a wife and a daughter, do those things. Can you imagine how difficult it is for her to get ready? I saw her roll in and I thought, oh my goodness, bless her heart. Bless her heart. She, without saying a word, just by having her son push her in a wheelchair, says to me, I don't feel well. I have some serious issues, but I wanted to be here tonight. And I'm here. And you can think of other people who are just such an encouragement to you. I know Katie is here with great pain. I read the list of things that she has wrong in her back, and I thought, that hurts me just to read that list, Katie. And yet, I asked her this morning, how are you doing? And she gave me one of those I'm here answers. And I thought, I can read between the lines. I know what that means. It means I don't feel well, but I made the effort to be here. And Katie, that just means a lot to me. As I sit here to see you, to know what you've gone through emotionally and physically, it means a lot to me. And there were people who knew what Paul had gone through, and they took courage. And they said, if Brother Paul did it, I can do it. If he came to preach in prison and counted it a good thing, I can preach wherever I am and count it a good thing. Now, it's interesting to me, you know how I feel about words. John confessed to us this morning that he likes to take things apart, put them back together again. I like to know what words mean, John. The word preach here doesn't mean what I'm doing now. It's a word that just simply means to talk to people. And I like that. And one reason I like that is because there are people who could say, I could never do what you do. Well, folks, it's as natural for me as anything. It's all I've ever done for 60 years. But you can talk to somebody about Jesus. You can. family, friends, neighbors, co-workers. I realize you have to be careful there. But in Acts chapter 8, when Paul was bringing great persecution on the church before his conversion, it says, those that were scattered abroad went everywhere, preaching or speaking the word. They always put in a good word for Jesus. How many of you in recent history have said to anybody, you know, I go to the Seymour Church of Christ and I really like it. We've got a lot of good things going. Why don't you join me? Why don't you go with me? How hard is that? And when somebody says, you say, how are you doing? And they say, well, I'll tell you what, I am so confused religiously. I don't know what to think or do. And we say, well, there's a lot of that going around. That really takes advantage of the situation, let me tell you. What if you say, let me help you with that? Or let me get somebody who can help you with that? There were people who were emboldened by the example of Brother Paul, who was in prison. But there were some hiccups along the way. Always are. If you think that life is going to be real easy and the path's going to be real smooth and everything's going to be all right for you, I've got news for you. You are so disillusioned. It does not work that way at all. And there were people, can you believe this, who were actually preaching out of envy and strife. They were preaching not to see people saved, but to somehow, and I'm not just sure I know how, but to somehow make things worse for Paul. Now, these were not unbelieving Jews. They could have cared less. They were not going to preach. This was not the Judaizing teachers. These were, in all probability, Christian evangelists. Can you believe that? And for whatever reason, they didn't like Paul. And they were going to do everything they could to make life worse for him. Were they embarrassed by Paul? I mean, it's not exactly a thing that you normally boast about. Hey, our preacher's in prison, you know. We don't normally think about things like that as being noteworthy. So were they embarrassed by Paul and tried to make it worse for him? Did they feel that somehow their leadership was being threatened? Maybe they had been the people who had their name on the bulletin, had been praised by everybody before Paul got in town. And they were going to do everything they could to bring him down a notch. I don't know. But he said there are people who preach Christ in verse 15, even from strife and envy. Can you believe it? But he says, but others out of goodwill. And Paul basically says, you know, none of that bothers me. Now, I think if I had been alive then, I would have taken to task those who were preaching out of envy and strife. I would have said, what's wrong with you guys? Why are you doing this? Paul's one of the good guys. Can you imagine all the things he's done over the years, all the sacrifices he's made, all the suffering and persecution he's gone through? Leave him alone. Paul said, the only thing I'm interested in is that Christ is preached. And I am set for the defense of the gospel. Now let me ask you this. Put yourself in Paul's place best you can. This is the second imprisonment, we'll believe it is. And you're arrested, and you know that the emperor has it in for you. And you know that you're going to get a chance to appear before him. What are you going to do? I suspect you're going to plead your case. I'm innocent. I'm a Roman soldier. I'm a Roman citizen, rather. You can't do this to me. I haven't committed any crime. You need to turn me loose. He did not say, I am set for a defense of Paul. He said, I am set for a defense of the gospel. What's Paul going to do to Nero? He's going to preach him a sermon. Doesn't mean Nero liked it. Some say that in the second imprisonment, right after the great fire that swept Rome, and Nero blamed it on the Christians, that one of the reasons that he had Paul beheaded was to give the sacrificial goat there. Perhaps. But Paul's going to preach to him. And Paul said, I rejoice in this. We say sometimes, you crazy or what? You have to wonder about Paul, don't you? He's in prison and he's happy. People are giving him a hard time and he's happy. Others are emboldened because of him and he's happy. Remember what the key word in Philippians is? Joy or rejoice. This is a letter about being happy. And Paul says it can even come out of bad. Do you believe that? Do you believe if the world gives you lemons that you can really make lemonade? Do you believe that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to His purpose? Well, I've come to this part. What are the lessons for us? I have two. Number one, Paul's greatest joy was the preaching of the gospel. However, whoever, whenever, he was a preacher. Today, it's not real popular to be a preacher. We say to our best and our brightest, you won't be a preacher. You never get rich that way. And if you preach for a congregation of 100, it means you're going to have 100 bosses, and you're never going to be able to keep them all happy. Why don't you be a doctor or a lawyer? I like to think that God only had one son and he was a preacher. I like to think that Paul was a preacher. And whoever and however and whenever he wanted people to know about Jesus. What about when we're in the hospital? Can we speak a good word for Jesus? What about when we're having a difficult time at work? Can we speak a good word for Jesus? What about in times of death and dying, can we speak a good word for Jesus? Can we be as excited about speaking for Him as Paul was? Can we see in everything that happens the opportunity to do something worthwhile? Here's number 2. God can use imperfect teachers and preachers. Even when there were people who were preaching out of envy and strife, Paul said at least the gospel's going out. People wonder sometimes why I feel the way I do about holidays. I know in the past, Christmas rolls around, you're supposed to preach your anti-Christmas sermon. Supposed to beat people over the head and tell them that Jesus wasn't born on Christmas. Do all of that kind of stuff and consign people who like Christmas carols and that kind of thing, the hottest place in hell. And when Easter rolls around, dare we say a word about the resurrection? We don't celebrate that. We celebrate the death of Jesus in the Lord's Supper. Here's my philosophy, folks. At that time of the year, or those times of the year, people are thinking about Jesus. And it gives me opportunities. And why would I ruin those opportunities? Why would I turn people off rather than tell them, there are things we don't know about Christmas, but tell you what, I'm glad He was born. I'm thankful that He was born the way He was born. Thankful for that virgin-born child. It was the Savior of the world, brought peace on earth, goodwill toward men. Who's the Savior of the world now? And when Easter rolls around, you can pretty well mark it down that I'll have some things to say about the resurrection, which is the single most important event of all of human history. The fact that He came out of that grave. And I'm glad. Yes, I'll remember the birth or the death of Jesus every Sunday in the Lord's Supper. But I also rejoice in that He's alive. God can take people and use them in ways that we will never imagine. There's a passage in 1 Corinthians 2 that I want to read. I want to begin at the first of the chapter. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 1. Chapter 2, verse 1. And I, brethren, when I came to you, did not come with excellence of speech or of wisdom, declaring to you the testimony of God. For I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. I was with you in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling. And my speech and my preaching was not with persuasive words of human wisdom, but a demonstration of the Spirit and the power, that your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. What are you saying, Paul? He said, I'm not the most eloquent man that ever spoke. But I just tell you about Jesus. I would to God that we had more people who said, I may not preach like I may not speak like angels. I may not preach like Paul. But I can tell the love of Jesus. I can say that He died for all. There's not a person here tonight of any age that can't do that. And so you think about it. Next time somebody says, you want to have the devotional, oh, I could never do that. I am so scared. I'll bet you can talk about your favorite subject till the cows come home, however long that is. Can you just tell people about Jesus? Can you just speak a good word? I want you to be here Wednesday night. We're going to get to hear somebody we haven't heard for a long time. I remember when Keith McCord would extend the invitation, give the invitation devotional. I said, Keith, I'd like to hear you do that again. He thought for a minute, looked at me and said, okay. He said, when? I told him this next Wednesday night. He said, I'll make that work. I don't know what he had to do to clear his calendar, but I'll make that work. Keith, I'm proud of you, buddy. And he did come up to me and say, how long do I have? He said, I don't want to violate any laws, like we will arrest him if he goes over. I told him 5 or 10 minutes, but hey, we've got people who can't tell time in here when they give the devotional. You just take your time. Say what's on your heart to say. I wish we had more people like that. And I want to remind us that we're not the one who makes the good come out of the bad. It's God who does it in and through us. But I like the story of Paul and how he felt about things that happened. Seeing that Jesus is preached should be the greatest joy and the most important focus of our lives.